Welcome back to Zone Football Worldwide. Hello. In every year and every generation in each sporting discipline, there are standout players, great players, and even legendary players who seem to achieve what was previously believed impossible. We occasionally get a player by that, or a trainer, who alters. Not only do they achieve the previously unthinkable, but they also encourage those around them to change in order to stay up. And no man personifies this more in terms of football as Pep Guardiola. In truth, there is a clear distinction between the pre-Pep era and the post-Pep era in modern football. Watching most top teams, Pep Guardiola has transformed the way managers think about how goalkeepers, center backs, fullbacks, pivot midfielders, and attackers all play nowadays, and his influence can be seen everywhere. In fact, the only position where he hasn't had much influence is the winger. But let's examine exactly how Pep has influenced all of these different departments. Pep Guardiola may not have created any of the ideas above, but he undoubtedly had the most significant part in reintroducing them to a contemporary public. And it all began when he made his debut in 2008 with the Barcelona team. Barcelona had a talented team, having recently won the Champions League, but they were underperforming. When Pep replaced Frank Rijkaard, their impact was immediate. The most significant aspect may have been that Pep had a broad philosophy that he adhered to almost dogmatically during a time when the majority of managers were more pragmatic and concentrated on game-by-game adaptations. High possession, numerical dominance, high pushing, as well as anything else that falls under the huge L, were the main pillars of this. They positioned this new umbrella. Not just top teams, but practically all top teams want to adhere to these very same standards. Even smaller teams make an effort to do this by cooperating as a unit and placing an emphasis on the collective over the individual in an effort to make up for the financial and skill shortfalls with the top teams. The 4-3-3, which Pep believed to be the ideal for this possession, served as the framework for Pep's ideology. Philosophy. Again, it was a configuration that many teams were adopting, but soon after Pep's breakthrough, clubs across the continent who had opted for the 4-3-3-4-4-2 or a back three merged into a 4-3-3 in an effort to replicate it. But setting up players in a 4-3-3 was just one way that Pep made this philosophy work. In order for it to be effective, the manner assault started had to be modified. Yet, there is an issue with this because Pep Guardiola philosophy heavily emphasized numerical superiority. Yet, there was a chance of a 10 versus 10 on the ball if they were playing against a strong pressing side, which indicates that there will be an excessive reliance on individual quality. This implied that they would always be in the lead unless the opposing goalkeeper had the audacity to join the press. Therefore, Pep asked that the goalkeeper not only be technical enough to send clever passes to the man who emerged free when the keeper was pushed, but also gutsy enough not to panic when he did come under pressure. In order to help him, Victor Valdez mastered this. Manuel Neuer was ahead of the curve and could already do so as Joe Hart had to be disposed of to eventually bring in Edison. And today, as more and more top teams turn toward possession, as a result, they can practically directly thank Pep for almost continually being cross-examined by other top goalies like Edward Mendy and David Hare, since they know it's nearly impossible to implement without a ball-playing keeper. And as we previously stated, it would take a fairly insane manager to get his goalkeeper to participate in the press during defense. As Pep is essentially a borderline insane manager, the opening for a potential through ball from the opposition has widened when his team is pressing with a high line on the halfway line. The starting position of the goalkeeper has therefore had to change to reduce that area, typically to just outside the box, so that if a ball is played through, the goalkeeper is prepared to sweep. But the evolution of goalkeepers is just the top within the iceberg, being pressed, fine touch. For center backs who weren't expecting to be skilled with the ball, that used to be the standard catchphrase. At their finest, they would appear to be respectable long passes aimed for a large target man or balls into the channel. But Pep was aware that these long balls would turn the ball from being completely under his team's control to a 50-over-50 aerial ball. And the goalkeeper who played with the ball was probably going to try to locate. The center backs have to be excellent on the ball and to be solid. Pep started dropping them extremely deep and wide, with the pivot on the edge, because in his early days, before a rule changed, the goal kick allowed players to receive inside the box. If the center backs had maintained their normal position, though, the opposition forwards could put them under immediate pressure, meaning at least 4 participants must commit. Press leaving at 7 versus 6 high rope for a man-to-man match. Once the ball began, Pep also tried to trade for 1 or 2 center backs after the regulation change from the goalkeeper. The ultimate objective remains to push the opposition's defense farther up the field to create spaces for the midfield and front. Even when the team was performing better, the center backs needed to be much more like orchestrators than in previous iterations because they were looking to play line-breaking passes as well as big switches. Yet, that wasn't an issue because it's still challenging for center backs to have the same impact on the ball as midfielders. In certain past squads, the midfielder was mostly a destroyer who, at worst, merely appeared to be competent with the ball and passed it to more skilled players. The pivot was rarely used by more dynamic teams, which frequently used box-to-box midfielders who were faster on and off the ball. Nonetheless, Pep popularized the idea of the defensive midfielder serving as the team's engine and the pivot around which the rest of the players move. Additionally, Pep was a leading proponent of La Salida, Lavelle, and Paima during this initial phase. To constantly have a man advantage, Pep started dropping his defensive midfielders between the center backs. This allowed the front two to go man-to-man against the center backs in open play. The pivot has to be outstanding as well. On the money, would then be able to narrate from that location. Play deep or would attract a midfielder on the other team, out of place. These tactics, along with having a very skilled defensive midfielder, have now become the norm for the majority of clubs. So let's go on to one of his most recent and standout inventions. Before Pep entered the picture, the fallback position had been changing throughout the previous few seasons. The main tasks of fullbacks are now anticipated to overlap, especially when they are paired with inverted wingers who will be cutting inside. They therefore typically worked in these enormously lengthy lines. But Pep's experience in the Bundesliga forced him to adjust, and as a result, football around the world gained a new source of inspiration. His prior system would buy in if you played with it. He soon understood that German teams were great at making the changes. This meant that despite having 3 men back to defend, they were still exposed. He was also aware that Robin and Ribery, who were both outstanding in one-on-one, were his best attackers. Also, Pep wanted to set up these one-on-one situations as frequently as he could. Thus, it was unnecessary to have traditional overlapping fullbacks draw in additional defenders. He just so happened to be playing with 2 of the best fullbacks in football, David Alaba and Philipp Lahm, at Bayern Munich. Pep decided to move his fullbacks inside into the midfield position in order to accomplish 2 goals at once. This preserved the 1v1 formation out wide and made it so that, on the transition, there was a solid block of 5 instead of just 3 players to get past. Thus, the fullbacks swiftly transitioned from being essentially employed to cross in the final third to becoming players who saw more of the ball. And the majority of the other outfielders, which required the fullbacks to become more and more technically adept, a trend that will undoubtedly continue. And having fullbacks essentially gave midfielders new options. When the inverted fullbacks were present at Manchester City, Pep created the 3/8 because they had less responsibilities now. Many have questioned whether Kevin De Bruyne or David Silva would be given free run as the 10 before his arrival. They both had experience moving wide at the spendable hub in Fernandinho, where they both played, as well as 2 inverted fullbacks. So if you wanted to play both, you would undoubtedly have to do so. Pep made the decision to actually pay 10 seconds. When in extremely deep phases, these 2 midfielders will play as traditional central midfielders, but when in high phases, they will occupy the spaces often occupied by a roaming 10. Yet, given that the threat and duty were shared by 2, they could divide zone 14 in half, effectively acting in one of the half spaces outside the forward. And when before, even during practice, coaches would divide the field into the following zones, with zone 14 being considered the most crucial area. Instead, the pitch was divided up in this way according to Pep's new way of thinking about football, with an emphasis on occupying these zones, half spaces. The front might then be formed as a result. The majority of back fours would be overloaded by 5 attackers, which would enable the wingers and the men in the half spaces to build a solid alliance. Football has always had second strikers, but most of the time they were merely roving forwards who played off another forward. And when Zlatan joined Barcelona, it appeared as though he would play as the center forward, leaving Messi to play on the right wing. At most, though, Messi would replace Zlatan as the backup attacker. Pep, though, made the decision to completely drop Ibrahimovic in favor of using Messi as a lone secondary forward with no one in front of him. As a false 9, the power 9 would need to be extremely match-smart to know when to make runs in the back to weaken their defense. It was necessary for this forge to be able to occasionally drop into the midfield to prevent them from being overloaded. And the false 9 had to be technical enough to actually operate as a midfielder. This was especially important with the defensive midfielder drop in deep. They might have the center overload if the defensive midfielder was also high, which would benefit their possession-oriented style of play. Pep Guardiola may not have come up with all of these ideas on his own, but the way he combined them with the success and flair his teams displayed during play inspired a generation of coaches and literally changed the way football is played, from the best teams all the way down to non-league football. This is a remarkable accomplishment, and it will be intriguing to see what other ideas Pep comes up with going forward. But that's all I have for now. Keep it simple, always. Thank you for watching, and please like the video. And subscribe to the channel and check other interesting videos on the channel.